Okay, so you sent this over to us, the proposed Waqf Amendment Bill from 2025.
Yeah.
And honestly, looking at it in detail has been fascinating.
Right.
Yeah, so what we really want to do today is distill it down to the absolute core.
Mm-hmm.
For the listeners who are interested in this kind of thing, which is, I think, a lot of people who listen to our show,
I think so, yeah.
we want to go over the bill itself, but then also some of the reactions to it,
Of course.
because there have been some pretty strong reactions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why we need to lay this all out in front of everyone so they understand what's going on.
Exactly. Help people understand all the different perspectives and everything.
Yeah, and the different perspectives are crucial here.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's start with just a very basic level for the listeners who are maybe not as familiar with this
Okay, sure.
stock properties.
Yeah, so essentially Waqf properties are charitable endowments, specifically within the Muslim community.
Right. Okay.
They can be thought of as being similar to trusts or foundations.
Oh, okay. So there's a parallel there.
Yeah, there's a strong parallel there. They're often set up for religious purposes, sometimes social welfare purposes,
Gotcha.
and they're intended to be these long-term assets.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah, that support whatever the stated purpose is.
Okay. So that's a good baseline, I think, for folks to understand.
Yeah.
Now, this bill specifically proposes changes to how these Waqf properties are handled. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. This bill isn't establishing the idea of Waqf.
Gotcha.
This is amending how it's all been working.
Yeah.
And we're going to go over those specific changes.
Okay. Sounds good.
The government's reasoning behind those changes, and of course, as you said, the concerns that have been raised in response.
Perfect. So why don't we start with maybe one of the biggest points of contention?
Sure.
And something that's really sort of been a focal point in the sources you've provided.
Right.
The whole thing about who gets to serve on these Waqf boards still.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the big changes this bill proposes is requiring that non-Muslims be appointed to these boards.
Oh, wow.
Now, previously, Waqf boards were composed entirely of Muslim members.
Okay, so this is a pretty significant change.
Yeah, it's a significant shift. And one of our sources points out that this is kind of an interesting contrast to how religious institutions in other communities,
Right.
like Hindu, Sikh, Christian organizations, how they're managed.
Okay, so those are typically managed by members of their own community.
Exactly. They are typically managed by individuals from within those communities themselves.
Yeah, so this kind of stands out.
It does stand out, and that's why it's been such a big point of discussion.
Okay, so I'm really curious to hear what the government's stated reason is for this change.
Yeah, so their argument is essentially that including non-Muslims on these Waqf boards will lead to more transparency
Oh, yeah.
in how the properties are managed, and that this will help in the fight against corruption.
Okay, so it's that outside perspectives that they're looking for.
Exactly. They believe that having a more diverse board membership could provide a more robust system of checks and balances.
Okay, so that makes sense from a certain perspective.
Right, and it's a common argument for diversity on boards in general.
Right, but I imagine this hasn't been universally welcomed by the Muslim community.
You're absolutely right. There's been a lot of pushback and criticism on this point.
Okay.
The main argument against it is that requiring non-Muslim members is seen as a form of government intrusion into the religious affairs of the Muslim community.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. They would see it that way.
Right, and it raises concerns about their religious autonomy,
Yeah.
The right to manage their own institutions without outside interference.
Right. Of course, that makes sense.
So essentially, they're saying, why is the government getting involved in how we manage our own religious spaces?
Yeah, that's a very valid point.
Mhm.
So it's like this clash between ensuring good governance and also respecting the autonomy of a religious community.
Exactly. And that's a tension that comes up a lot when you're talking about the role of the state in religious matters.
Yeah, always a complex issue, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a balancing act, and there's no easy answer.
No easy answer. Yeah, okay, so that's the board membership piece, which is obviously a huge thing.
Yeah.
But there's more.
Right. Oh, there's much more. This bill goes beyond just the membership of the boards.
Oh.
It also addresses the issue of government oversight over Waqf properties themselves.
Oh, okay, so the government wants more say in how those properties are actually managed.
That's right. It seems they're aiming to increase their level of control and oversight in this area.
Okay, so what does that actually look like? What specific changes are being proposed?
Well, for one thing, under this bill, Waqf boards would now need to get approval from district-level government officials
Okay.
just to have their claims over properties validated.
Oh, wow. Okay, so even just to say, yes, this property belongs to the Waqf board. they need government approval.
Exactly. It adds a whole new layer of bureaucracy to the process.
Wow, that's pretty significant. I mean, it's one thing to have a diverse board, but now it's like even having ownership is being questioned.
Right, and the bill also puts a really strong emphasis on documentation and verification of Waqf land ownership.
Right, which makes sense on the surface.
It does. It does on the surface because you want to make sure things are proper, but
But what's the but?
the but is that it's not always so straightforward.
Oh.
Especially when you're talking about properties that have been in the hands of these Waqf boards for centuries.
Right. Like, how do you even go back and document something from like 200 years ago?
Exactly, and that's one of the big concerns with this bill.
Okay, so what happens if they don't have that documentation?
Well, the government is actually proposing that they have the authority to re-examine property registrations
Wow.
that happened in the past.
So they're going back and basically saying, we're going to double check all of that.
Essentially, yes. And this is where it gets really tricky because you can imagine a situation where you have a historical mosque
Right.
or a dargah or even a graveyard that's been there for hundreds of years.
Right.
But there's no like modern, perfectly kept record with all the paperwork.
Right. Because back then they didn't think they would need that level of detail.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people are worried that this could lead to a whole bunch of legal challenges
Right.
over these historical sites.
Yeah, because suddenly ownership could be called into question.
Precisely. And that's a pretty big deal when you're talking about places that are so central to a community's religious and cultural heritage.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just a piece of land. It's.
It's history.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, how do you even begin to approach that?
That's a really good question, and I think that's what a lot of people are grappling with right now.
Okay, so that's the oversight piece.
Yeah.
Which is obviously already a lot.
Yeah.
But there's also the aspect of like, what happens to these properties?
Right.
Like in terms of leasing them or selling them?
Exactly. So the bill also proposes changes to the regulations surrounding the lease and sale of Waqf properties.
Okay, and what's the general direction there?
Well, the government's aim seems to be to make the rules much stricter than they are now.
And what's the rationale behind that?
They say it's all about preventing mismanagement of these assets.
Okay, so their argument is that the current system is allowing for too much mismanagement or potential for corruption.
Yes. They're saying that these stricter regulations are needed to protect these properties.
Okay.
And ensure that they're being used responsibly.
Okay, so what kind of specific regulations are we talking about here?
Well, any lease, sale, or transfer of Waqf land would require approval from a committee appointed by the government.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they're really adding that extra layer of government scrutiny.
They are, and this is another point that's drawn a lot of criticism.
Okay, yeah, I can see why.
Because the concern is that this level of control could ultimately lead to the government effectively taking over these Waqf lands.
Right. It's like one thing to have oversight, but then if you have to get approval for every little thing, then it's like...
Then it's almost like they're managing it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a pretty big concern.
It is, and it ties into this broader debate about who should have the authority over these religious assets.
Yeah, right, because it goes back to that autonomy question.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the board membership, the government oversight to changes to leasing and selling.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one more big thing, right?
Yes, one more that we need to discuss, and it's kind of a legal bombshell in a way.
Okay, lay it on me.
This bill proposes removing the special legal protections
that
Waqf properties have traditionally enjoyed.
Wait, so they had like special legal status before?
They did. They had a certain level of protection under the law that most other properties don't have.
Okay, so what kind of protection are we talking about?
Well, they had a degree of insulation against things like encroachment and seizure.
Oh, okay, so it was harder for people to just come in and say, hey, this is mine now.
Exactly. It provided a safeguard for these properties.
Okay, so by removing that protection, what does that mean for the Waqf properties going forward?
It means they become a lot more vulnerable. Because now courts and other authorities can reassess claims on Waqf land.
Wow.
Without those previous legal hurdles.
Yeah, so suddenly these properties are open to challenges that they weren't open to before.
Exactly, and critics are saying this opens up a whole bunch of legal loopholes.
Yeah, so people could come in and use those loopholes to potentially take over these properties.
That's the fear, and it's not an unfounded fear given the other changes in this bill.
Right, all ties together. So let's take a step back for a second.
Okay.
We've talked about all these changes, all the concerns.
Mm-hmm.
But what is the government actually saying about this? Like, what is their justification for all of this?
Yeah, that's a really important question to ask because they do have a rationale,
Right.
and they've articulated it in various statements and documents.
Okay, so what's the gist of their argument?
Well, they're saying that these changes are necessary to combat corruption
Okay.
within Waqf boards.
Okay, so that's a big one. They're saying there's corruption and we need to stop it.
Yes, they're essentially arguing that the current system is too opaque and that it allows for mismanagement and potentially corrupt practices.
Okay, so that's part of it. What else?
They're also emphasizing the public interest aspect of Waqf properties.
Okay.
They're saying that these properties are meant to be used for the benefit of society.
Right, right. They are charitable endowments at their core.
Exactly. And so the government is arguing that they have a responsibility to ensure that these assets are being used effectively.
For the purpose that they were intended.
Yes, for their intended purpose, which is ultimately the welfare of the public.
Okay, so that's another part of it.
And the third part of their argument is about accountability.
Okay, so they want the wash boards to be more accountable.
Exactly. They're saying that increased government oversight is necessary to hold these boards accountable for how they manage these properties.
Okay, so their argument boils down to three main points. Combating corruption, ensuring public interest, and increasing accountability.
Yes, those are the three pillars of their justification for this bill.
Okay, so we've heard from the government, but obviously there's a whole other side to this.
Right.
There's a lot of opposition to this bill.
There is. And it's vocal, and it's coming from various segments of society.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What are some of the key arguments against this bill?
Well, as we've already touched upon, one of the biggest concerns is that it represents an overreach by the government.
Okay.
An unwarranted interference in the religious affairs of Muslims.
Right. It goes back to that question of religious autonomy.
Exactly. And that's a core principle for many people, and they see this bill as undermining that principle.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's the whole issue of the historical sites and the documentation requirements.
Yes, that's a major point of contention.
Because, as we talked about earlier, a lot of these properties are so old.
Hundreds of years old in some cases.
Right. That the idea of having modern-style documentation is just unrealistic.
It's unrealistic, and critics are saying it's a deliberate attempt to create a problem where none exists.
Right. So it's like they're setting them up for failure, almost.
That's the feeling among many, and it feeds into this suspicion that this whole thing is about the government wanting to seize Waqf lands.
Oh, wow. Okay, so there's a real lack of trust there.
There is, and it's not just about the historical sites. There's also this concern that the government might use the legal verification process as a way to basically grab land.
So under the guise of, oh, we're just making sure everything's in order, they could actually be taking control of these properties.
Exactly, and that's a very serious concern.
Yeah, it is, and it kind of reminds me of situations we've seen in other countries where governments have used similar tactics.
Yeah, there are historical precedents for this sort of thing, which is why people are so worried.
Right, it's not coming out of nowhere.
No, it's not. And then on top of all of that, there's the criticism that this bill unfairly targets minority institutions compared to, say, Hindu religious trusts.
So they're saying there's a double standard here.
Yes. They're arguing that Hindu trusts, which also manage a lot of property and assets,
don't face the same level of government scrutiny and intervention.
So it's like, why us?
Exactly. It's that sense of being singled out and unfairly targeted.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a pretty powerful argument if you feel like you're being treated differently.
It is. And it taps into these broader issues of religious freedom and equality.
Right. Right. It becomes a much bigger issue than just this one bill.
It does. It goes to the heart of how different religious communities are treated within the country.
Yeah. Okay. So we've heard the arguments for and against. We've kind of unpacked this whole thing. But where does it actually stand right now?
Good question. So as of today, the bill has been passed.
Oh, wow. Okay.
By the Lok Sabha.
So that's the lower house of parliament.
That's right. The lower house of India's parliament.
Yeah.
And it passed with a pretty significant majority.
Okay. So what was the vote count?
288 in favor of the bill.
Wow.
And 232 against it.
Okay. So it wasn't unanimous, but it definitely passed.
It cleared that first legislative hurdle.
Right. But it's not law yet, right?
Yeah, no. Okay, what's next in the process?
Well, the bill now goes to the Rajya Sabha, which is the upper house of parliament.
Okay.
And they'll debate it. They'll vote on it.
So it has to pass there as well.
It does. It needs to be approved by both houses of parliament.
Okay.
And then if it passes the Rajya Sabha, the final step is presidential assent.
Right, from the president of India?
Correct. And right now the president is Draupadi Murmu.
Got it. So she would have the final say.
She would either sign the bill into law,
Right.
or she could choose to send it back to Parliament for reconsideration.
Oh, wow. Okay, so there's still a chance it could be stopped.
There is. It's not a done deal yet.
Okay, so to kind of sum up everything we've talked about, this proposed law represents a pretty big change in how Muslim charitable endowments are managed in India.
It does. It really redefines the relationship between the government and these Waqf institutions.
Okay, and the government is presenting it as a positive thing, right?
They are. They're saying this is about transparency, good governance, making sure these assets are used properly.
Right, that's their side of the story.
That's their perspective.
But on the flip side, there are some serious concerns within the Muslim community.
Well, absolutely.
About losing control over their religious assets.
Yes, that's a major fear. And it's understandable given the scope of this bill.
Right. They're worried about their historical sites. They're worried about the potential for land grabs. They're worried about being unfairly targeted.
It's a lot to be concerned about.
Yeah, so it's really going to come down to what happens in Parliament.
It is. The final decision there will determine the fate of this bill.
Right, and ultimately how these Waqf institutions are going to be impacted.
Exactly. This is a story that's still unfolding.
Yeah, and one that we'll definitely be following closely.
I think everyone should, because it touches upon some really fundamental issues about the relationship between religious institutions, the role of the state, and how we manage community assets in a diverse society.
Yeah, it's not just about this one bill. It's about a much bigger picture.
It really is.
Okay, well, this has been so insightful. I really appreciate you taking the time to break all of this down.
My pleasure. I think it's important to have these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully this gives listeners a much clearer understanding of what's going on with this bill.
I hope so. I think being informed is the first step to engaging in these issues.
Yes, definitely. And maybe this will even inspire some folks to, do their own research and look into this further.
That would be fantastic.
So I like to leave listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
And this whole conversation has really been revolving around this question of religious autonomy versus the need for accountability.
Right.
And I think it's a question that goes beyond just this one issue.
It does. It's a question that societies around the world are grappling with.
Exactly. So here's a thought for you to consider.
Okay.
Given those two things that we've been talking about, religious autonomy and accountability, what principles should guide how we govern religious endowments?
That's a great question.
Right. It's like, how do we find that balance?
It's the eternal question, and there's no easy answer.
No, but it's one that we have to keep asking ourselves.
Absolutely.
Especially in a diverse society like ours, where we have so many different religious communities.
It's more important now than ever.
Yeah. So I encourage everyone listening to really give that some thought.
Me too.
And if you're interested in this particular bill, you might want to follow what happens in the Rajya Sabha.
Definitely keep an eye on it.
Because that's going to be the next chapter in this story.
It is, and it's a story that's going to have a real impact on people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to all the listeners for taking this deep dive with us.